Welcome, and thanks for joining us. My name is Kara Bloomberg, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer of LandrumHR. Many of you attending today are clients, and we appreciate your partnership and participation today in the webinar. For those that aren't familiar with LandrumHR, we're a professional services firm with over 50 years of serving clients across the country. We provide PEO or HR services that include payroll, benefits, workers' compensation, and HR. We also provide worksite management, which is a customized labor solution for companies that use large numbers of temporary workers. Our HRQ division focuses on 3 integrated services: enterprise-wide human capital consulting, providing interim HR talent, and conducting searches for HR professionals nationwide. Our consulting team brings a depth of experience in workforce planning and analytics, talent management, and talent strategy projects, org design, and HR transformation. In addition, we provide HR on-call services and virtual learning offerings. You can find out more about all of our services by visiting our websites, LandrumHR.com and HRQinc.com. A recording of this webinar will be sent to everyone who registered today, so please feel free to ask questions. We have a question pane in the control panel, and we'll try to get to some of those at the end of the presentation today. There's also going to be a quick survey that pops up as you exit the webinar, and we'd appreciate your feedback. Love to get more information about other topics that you'd like to hear more about from us at LandrumHR. So it's my pleasure to introduce our General Counsel, Amie Remington. Amie spent the last 15 years of her career at LandrumHR. Amie has over 20 years in the employment law arena, and she's a national speaker on employment law topics. So Amie, before I hand it over to you, I thought we'd jump right in with an attendee poll, and that has to do with the subject matter about President Biden's executive order. So I'm going to launch the poll and ask our attendees if they can participate with us. So the question today is, do you believe President Biden's executive order will directly impact your business? So I want to get a sense, Amie, of what our attendees are thinking, how much maybe they've read about the executive orders or heard, and then it'll be interesting to maybe, as we round out the discussion today, see if anything's changed for everyone. But I'm going to go ahead and close out our poll. Thanks so much for participating. And Amie, 44% yes, 4% no, and 52% unsure. So it sounds like you've got a lot of people really interested in hearing what we have to say today, Amie.
Great, thank you, Kara. And I think that we can emphasize some of the reasons that the executive orders will matter to employers, and that's what we're going to focus on today. And as we start today, the first thing I want to say is the Biden administration really hit the ground running with work that they began. From Election Day to Inauguration Day, the Biden transition team was actively engaged in creating both policies and processes that reflected their campaign promises. And today we're going to talk about a variety of executive orders signed by President Biden since his first day in office, since Inauguration Day. But as a basis, I want to start with the difference between an executive order and a law. So any person like me who grew up on Schoolhouse Rock remembers that song, I'm Just a Bill on Capitol Hill, which I won't sing to you guys, and you can thank me later for that. But in that song, kids of the 70s and 80s are going to remember that to be effective, for a law to become effective as a law, it must go through an entire legislative congressional process. And this means that a law has to pass both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And the House, of course, has 465 members, and so you have to have a simple majority of 218. And then the Senate has 100 members, and so it has to pass with a simple majority of 51. And then, of course, it has to be signed by the president, who could veto it. After it can go through the House and the Senate, it can then be vetoed, or it can be signed. And in the event of a tie on the Senate floor, you'll remember from the Georgia elections in 2020 that the vice president cast a deciding vote. But at the end of the day, it becomes effective when it's signed by the president. Now, an executive order, on the other hand, doesn't have to go through this whole process. An executive order allows a president to bypass this process. But at the end of the day, the executive order and a law have the same power and the same enforcement. So one of the questions I've had, because I think Biden got off to a quick start with executive orders, is how often are these used? And the answer is a lot. They have been used as long as we have had presidents. Our very first president signed 8 executive orders. After the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant signed 217 presidential executive orders. And between 1933 and 1945, so basically think about from the Great Depression to the beginning of World War II, President Roosevelt signed a whopping 3,728 executive orders. So they've been used a lot, and they've been used more frequently, more recently as well. So more recently, they've been used by Presidents Bush, Clinton, Obama, and the most recent President Trump. So you'll see that there's there's no math that Republicans do it more frequently or Democrats use it more frequently. There's no real math on that. Presidents just use them, you can see very, very frequently. Now, if we were to have a race to see which president signed the most executive orders during the first days of administration, I do think President Biden would win that race. So you can see that immediately upon being elected, his team got to work. And this chart and the language at the top of the chart comes from CNN, and it says that from the date of inauguration through April 8th, it compares the 4 recent presidents with the number of executive orders that were signed at the beginning of, basically in the first 3 months almost, of an administration. And you can see that Biden has won that race in terms of being very proactive right out of the gate. In fact, on day 1, Inauguration Day, President Biden signed 9 executive orders. The first one was called Advancing Racial Equality and Support for Underserved Communities Through the Federal Government. And on the second day in office, he signed another 7 executive orders. So between Inauguration Day and April 8th, you can see that over 3 dozen, almost 4 dozen, were signed. So let's look at the content of the executive orders. What do they relate to? Well, during President Biden's campaign in 2020, you'll probably remember that he made many promises related to fairness and equity for all people. He spoke frequently about fairness and equity in the workplace. And another major talking point of his was COVID-19, the coronavirus. So if I were asked to develop a theme of the executive orders, the theme I would choose would be the protection of workers during the pandemic and the improvement of the economy for the whole United States. So you can see this chart, again, was pulled from CNN, and it talks about the different types of executive orders that were signed. It categorizes them by subject matter. And you can see that the coronavirus had many executive orders. Immigration was a close second, and then equity and the economy and the environment. So you can see how those line up. But one thing I'll tell you is that many executive orders the topic might be coronavirus, but it also deals with the economy. Or the topic might be immigration, but it also deals with the economy. So many of these executive orders blend topics. So what I want to do is tell you guys what's relevant to you. What's relevant to a business owner, what executive orders might really affect you and that you might really want to pay attention to. So if you're going to pull an executive order, you pull up my number. And so you'll see that I've listed the numbers in there. And I'm going to give you the number of the executive order so that if you want to look at it, you just go to the Federal Register, you type in that number, and the actual executive order will come up. But the first employment-related executive order is related to COVID-19. It is called Organizing and Mobilizing the United States Government to Provide a Unified and Effective Response to Combat COVID-19 and to provide the United States leadership on global health and security. So it's a long name. But what this executive order says is that a position of coordinator of the COVID-19 response and counselor to the president would be established. So it's a new position. And this new position would have duties related to COVID-19. And this position would be responsible for coordinating a government-wide effort to reduce disparities. And these disparities would be in the response and the care and the treatment of COVID-19. This job is also responsible for coordinating the United States government's efforts to produce, supply, and distribute PPE, and to disseminate vaccines, and to disseminate tests for COVID-19. And a third task of this job is to coordinate the federal government's efforts to expand COVID-19 testing and the delivery of vaccines. And then the last big duty of this job would be to coordinate the United States government's efforts to support the safe reopening of schools and child care providers. So this is not a small job. This is a massive, massive job that has tentacles all over all facets of COVID-19, from PPE to reopening schools. And so the first portion of this EO relates to employment, because the position of coordinator of the COVID-19 response and counselor to the president will have a direct impact on the rules that are created for businesses to follow in the wake of the pandemic. So I think we can anticipate that we will see this coordinator, and this coordinator will be actively involved with creating rules for private sector and public sector businesses to follow in the future. It's also relative to businesses because it orders the safe reopening of schools and child care centers. So here's a little fact. According to the United States Census, there was a March, there are 10 million mothers living in the United States who have school-aged children at home. Now, of those, there are 10 million that were not actively working in January of 2021, and that's 1.4 million of these mothers with school-aged children who were not working as compared to the same month in 2020. So what that really means is that there are about 1.4 million women who are not working because they are staying home with school-aged children. And that's one reason that the getting the schools reopened is so important, because the pandemic had a devastating effect on employment overall, but especially on women in the workforce if those women had children at home when schools were closed. And the especially hard-hit industries included those that were service-oriented, or the industries that were entirely shut down as a result of the pandemic. For example, hospitality industries that were heavily shut down on an entire basis. So reopening schools will have a direct impact on improving the economy. So as I said, this is a COVID order, but you can see that it has a direct impact on the economy. So I mentioned the coordinator's responsibilities for dissemination of vaccines. And with respect to vaccines, you may recall in prior webinars that we talked about the Biden initiative to have 100 million vaccines in the first 100 days after Inauguration Day. So you can see this, the source of this is from the CDC. These statistics come directly from the CDC. And I actually looked at the CDC's website this morning, so I'll give you the updated number. But President Biden said he wanted to have 100 million vaccines in the first 100 days after Inauguration Day. And January was off to a slow start, but by February, there were about 50 million shots delivered. And by April 14th, there were 181 million shots delivered. And as of today, the CDC reports that there are over 213 million doses that have been administered. So if you would like to look at that trend, there are a lot of good trending sites that you can see. The CDC is one of them. One of the best ones, though, comes from Bloomberg. It's the Bloomberg tracker for CDC, so you can see how many vaccines have been delivered worldwide or in the United States, or first doses or second doses, or Moderna, Pfizer, or Johnson & Johnson. So if you want to look at that, the CDC and Bloomberg are great sources for tracking that. The next executive order that I want to mention is Executive Order 13988. And this one is important, and I'm going to give you a little historical context. So Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is basically, I call it the grandfather of all employment laws. It prevents, very broadly, discrimination on a couple of key bases, but the Title VII forms the basis for which all other discrimination laws come out. So this law says that an employer may not consider certain factors in any employment decision, from hiring to termination and the life cycle in between. And one of those factors is sex. And sex has traditionally meant that employers couldn't discriminate against somebody because they were female or because of their gender. And in the recent past, 10 years, there's been a split among the federal courts on whether Title VII encompasses sexual orientation or gender identity as well as part of sex, or whether it's just purely based on somebody's biological gender. And what I mean by a split is that some federal courts felt like Title VII's protections on the basis of sex encompassed gender identity and sexual orientation, meaning employers could not discriminate on the basis of those factors. And other federal courts disagreed because the words gender identity and sexual orientation didn't appear anywhere in the content of Title VII. So there's been a lot of conversation about that and a lot of case law about that at the federal level. But Executive Order 13988 clarified that and made it crystal clear. The order is called Preventing and Combating Discrimination on the basis of Gender Identity and Sexual Orientation. And so the name alone gives you a pretty good idea of what the order is going to say. But the order specifically says that adults in America should be able to earn a living and pursue a vocation, knowing that they will not be fired or demoted or mistreated because of who they go home to in the evening, or because how they dress might not conform with sex-based stereotypes. And the executive order specifically references some prior case law, which we've talked about in many of our presentations in years past. And it says that it is the policy of the Biden administration to prevent discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation. And it directs the federal agencies to interpret all federal anti-discrimination statutes prohibiting sex discrimination, like, for example, Title VII or Title IX, to protect against discrimination on the basis of three factors: sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. So that means that the EEOC, for example, will be revising any guidance it has where it talks about sex-based discrimination to specifically include sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. So that issue has now been resolved, and Title VII will encompass those types of things. So employers who are subject to Title VII, those with 15 or more employees, can't discriminate on those bases any longer. And that's in keeping with many state laws, and it's in keeping with a lot of municipal ordinances as well. So the next one I want to talk about is 13991. And this is another one we've talked about in prior webinars, but the executive order, again, creates clarity. So the CDC has had a record busy year over the past year, creating new guidances and constantly updating information for all employers. Their website has been a living, breathing, evolving website that has changed on a daily basis to keep employers up to date. The CDC has long taken the position that mask wearing is a very effective way to prevent the spread of COVID-19. If you go on the CDC's website this morning, You'll see many articles on the front page of the website, and the articles talk about wearing masks, the consideration for wearing masks, improving masks, statistics on how the use of masks can slow the spread of COVID. But the CDC doesn't have the force of law. Instead, it provides guidance to agencies and to employers. This executive order, which does have the force of law, is called Protecting for the Federal Workforce and Requiring Mask Wearing. So again, like the prior one, you can probably guess what it says. This executive order specifically requires all federal workers and all people who interact with federal workers to wear masks. It also requires them to maintain physical distances and to adhere to other public safety measures as provided in the CDC's guidelines. So what does this mean to you? If you're a private sector employer, it means that if you are working with a federal agency, a post office, the Social Security Administration, if you are a long-haul driver on the road and you've got Department of Transportation requirements, if you have any in-person visits with a federal agency, an OSHA person comes to your door, for example, or you have to go to an OSHA site, then it means you must comply with all of these guidelines. It also means that if you are a federal contractor, and I know at LandrumHR we have several clients that are federal contractors, Section 2 of this executive order specifically applies to you because it requires that all federal contractors comply with the CDC guidelines as well. So the takeaway for our non-federal contractor clients is that this executive order follows the theme of worker safety and can be expected to continue, and all employers are charged with taking proactive steps to protect their workforces. And it's actually an excellent segue into the next executive order, which is 13999. This executive order is called Protecting Worker Health and Safety. And it says that protecting the health and safety of workers is a national priority and a moral imperative. Specifically, it says that OSHA is tasked with providing safety for all workers in the United States during the pandemic, which is no small task, right? They're responsible for the safety of all workers in the United States during the pandemic. And the reason that this is relevant to most employers, whether you're public or private, is that most private employers and federal government employers and federal contractors are covered by OSHA. So this executive order may require them to implement additional safety precautions, for example. It's especially timely as the White House just reported on Friday of last week that the Biden administration plans to nominate Doug Parker to lead federal OSHA. He will be the Assistant Secretary of Labor for OSHA. And so I think it's always relevant to look at the background of where somebody comes from to get an idea for what we might expect in the future. So Mr. Parker is currently the chief of the California division of OSHA, which is called Cal OSHA. At Cal OSHA, he played a role in developing California's COVID-19 workplace safety response. Now, the good news is that he has a good reputation in the state of California for working well with California businesses. He's economy mind forward. He is very safety oriented, but he can balance that with an employer's need to run a business. So again, I think this executive order is very timely, given the nomination that came out just last week. So we shared this information in a prior webinar, but it is worth repeating that OSHA has created a new guidance. It was created in January on how to create a COVID program. It came out earlier this year, but it still remains in effect. So if you haven't created a COVID-19 program and haven't created some policies and procedures, it's a great time to do that. You don't have to create all 10 of these steps. You have to do what's appropriate for your business, but this is a great guideline for what steps you need to take. The other timely information is that OSHA fines went up earlier this year. The Trump administration saw a decline in OSHA enforcement, and in fact, OSHA enforcement was at a 45-year low. But I would not assume, if I were a business owner, that this trend would continue. Instead, I think it's a very, very good time for employers to walk through their businesses, look at all safety measures, ensure that businesses are in compliance, because I would predict a substantial uptick in the number of OSHA investigations and in the number of OSHA penalties that might result. So what's your takeaway? Whether you're public sector, private sector, federal contractor, or not. The takeaway, in my opinion, is that you should ensure that you are complying with all federal rules regarding worker safety. You should comply with all your state rules too, of course, because there are state agencies like Cal OSHA in almost every single state. So whether we're talking about federal OSHA, state OSHA, the CDC, or other state rules or other federal rules, worker safety is going to be of paramount importance during the Biden administration. It's a great time to look at your policies regarding safety, to retrain some employees regarding safety, to make sure your OSHA logs, that you understand what you're supposed to be doing and you're keeping those up to date. And of course, do all of this with an eye towards COVID so that if you're reopening, you can reopen safely. So the next one I want to mention is Executive Order 14,000. It's a second executive order that's related to schools, and it's going to be one that all parents are interested in, I promise you. This executive order is called Supporting the Reopening and Continued Operations of Schools and Early Childhood Education Providers. It first recognizes that health and safety of children in schools and educators and families and communities at large is of utmost importance. It second says that every student in the United States should have the opportunity to receive a high-quality education during and beyond the pandemic. And it orders that the Secretary of Education must take affirmative steps to reopen schools in a safe manner. So like the very first executive order, it addresses reopening of schools. This one is more specific to schools, whereas the first one was a blend of schools as it related to the economy. The next one that I want to talk about is Executive Order 14003, and it outlines a movement towards a $15 an hour minimum wage. Now, the executive order is directed towards federal employees and government contractors. This executive order is called Protecting the Federal Workplace. And again, in keeping with campaign promises, some states, in keeping with other campaign promises. And of course, some states already have minimum wages that exceed the federal minimum wages. For example, you can see that in DC, in California, those are, in Washington State, those are among the highest. The current minimum wage from the federal government is $7.25 an hour. And by state, you can see that many states exceed that minimum wage, but then there are some states that don't exceed that wage. So if it went through Congress and it were passed, it would be part of the Fair Labor Standards Act and it would go up, probably gradually. Because again, this applies to federal government contractors and federal employees, but it could reflect a trend toward the future. So Kara, can you launch us a poll on the minimum wage?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. This is a really interesting topic. We have so many clients, especially here in Florida, that are preparing for the $15 an hour minimum wage increase, and we're doing a lot of work with those clients in preparation. But we wanted to get an idea from all of our attendees across the country with respect to the minimum wage and the potential of a federal increase. And how do you feel you've prepared or beginning to think about what that would mean for your business? So the question is, with respect to the potential $15 minimum wage, has your business, A, already increased your business's minimum wage to 15? B, you've made arrangements in case 15 becomes a requirement, so kind of starting to think about it and strategically plan. And C, not addressed the issue yet. So I know this may also be by location, because some states are kind of rushing towards this a little bit faster than others, but certainly as we see the door opening for federal increase, it affects all of us. So Amie, I'm going to thank all of the attendees for participating and close this out and show you our results. All right, so a little all over the place here. 26% already increased the business's minimum wage to $15, so a bit ahead of the curve or in a place where they needed to do that already. 29% making arrangements. So a lot of people planning already to make a change, and then 46% not addressing this yet. How does that line up with what you're thinking, Amie?
Gosh, that's what I love about the polls, because our audience is so diverse and so many different employment models out there, business models, and people have different ways of being successful. So I think that's super interesting to find out. So let's go to the Department of Labor, which we were at minimum wage, which is part of the Department of Labor. But let's move a little more specifically to that. So executive orders can create new law, as we've seen, or they can revoke prior executive orders. So one president can issue an executive order that's exactly opposite of a prior president, and it can take the place of it or revoke it. So one executive order, the one we just talked about, 14003, actually revokes the Trump administration executive order regarding collective bargaining rights. So in addition to the $15 hour minimum wage, it actually revokes a prior Trump administration executive order. It also provides additional civil penalties for more federal jobs. Civil protections for more federal jobs. One important thing about this executive order is that it specifically addresses collective bargaining by federal employees. So the takeaway for employers is that collective bargaining by employees of private sector employers is likely to be looked upon more favorably by the current new Department of Labor Secretary, Marty Walsh, than it was by the prior Department of Labor Secretary, who was Alex Acosta. This is because Marty Walsh comes from the city of Boston, where he was the mayor, to the Department of Labor with a very pro-labor, pro-union background. In fact, his professional Twitter page from the mayor's office in Boston specifically identifies himself as a labor leader and said that personally he came from a labor family. So we can anticipate that collective bargaining will continue to be an issue. And just yesterday, I received a great blog from my friend Ted Kazagalis at Jackson Lewis, and it was on collective bargaining. So it was right in line with what we were talking about with this particular executive order. The blog said that upon entering office, President Biden removed the National Labor Relations Board General Counsel, Peter Robb, from office, which is not unusual. The president has a right to do that, and that happens with the change of administration. President Biden then named NLRB Attorney and Regional Director Peter Sung Orr as acting General Counsel. So why is this important? Well, this is important for private sector employers because in the 3 months since Orr's appointment, the NLRB has taken several actions that impact both unionized and non-unionized employers. On March 31st, which was less than a month ago, Acting General Counsel Orr issued a memorandum stating that his office will return to, quote, vigorous enforcement, end quote, of employee rights under Section 7 of the NLRA, the National Labor Relations Act. Specifically, in that March 31st memorandum, Orr encouraged a broader view of Section 7 protections to cover a wide range of employee conduct. It would include employees' political and social justice advocacy when the subject matter has a direct nexus to employees' interest as employees, and that's a quote from the memorandum. Examples of such behavior might include employees doing media interviews regarding living on minimum wage. If an employee were to do a solo strike to join a demonstration advocating for a higher minimum wage, or participate in a protest over political topics such as an immigration raid by the government. So as the board ramps up its outreach campaign to educate employees on their rights to engage in these protected concerted activities, many employees may find the NLRB a better option for asserting claims than a traditional lawsuit, because employees pursuing a claim under the National Labor Relations Act doesn't need to retain an attorney. So instead, they can go to the National Labor Relations Board, which would issue a complaint and prosecute the matter at no cost to the employee. The other thing that private sector employers need to be aware of is that, and this I found stunning, but according to Gallup poll, as of 2020, 65% of all Americans had some level of approving a labor union, which represents a 20-year high. So the question is, why is that such a high number? And the pandemic may be one of the reasons for this increase in support. Employers also need to be aware that this comes at a time when the House of Representatives just voted to pass the Protect the Right to Organize Act, which is the PRO Act. And the PRO Act may not pass the Senate, but it should signal a shift in employees' acceptance of unions. So if you're a union-free workplace and you wish to remain a union-free workplace, the takeaway for you is that it's a great time for you to look at your compensation and your benefits. It's a great time for you to look at your policies and procedures to make sure that all of this is equitable and all of it's in line. It's easier, if you wish to remain union-free, it's easier to prevent employees from unionizing if they're happy and feel like they're treated fairly and have adequate representation in front of an employer than it is to stop union action once it's begun. So training supervisors is also a great idea. Supervisors need to understand these protections and need to understand anti-retaliation provisions of the law to make sure that there's no unintentional retaliation that takes place. So union activity is a big topic. The executive order deals with it from a federal contractor and a federal employee level, but my best advice is that if you are a private sector employer and you are union-free and you wish to remain union-free, you really need to be proactive and make sure that you're doing everything possible to remain union-free by treating people as well as you can possibly treat them. Policies and procedures are going to be of utmost importance, not just for that purpose, but for all purposes of having a healthy workplace. So finally, we're going to move to Executive Order 14020, which relates to gender equity. And this was a major topic in the Biden campaign. This executive order is called Establishment of the White House Gender Policy Council. Its goal is to advance gender equity and equality as a matter of human rights, justice, and fairness. It's a strategic imperative. According to the executive order, it is a strategic imperative that reduces poverty and promotes economic growth for the entire United States. And the goal is to work towards advanced equal rights and opportunities based on gender in the workplace. So the council will be a council of people, and their job will be to create policies that combat systemic bias and sexual harassment in a workplace. Its goal is also tied to increasing economic security by addressing the structural barriers to women's participation in the labor force and by decreasing the wage and wealth gap. And you might remember that the Trump administration on whitehouse.gov had an entire section that talked about the wage disparity based on gender in the workplace. And it showed that white women, Black women, and Latina women were paid less than males in the workplace. So this executive order continues that trend to address that issue that was recognized during the Trump administration on whitehouse.gov. So the takeaway for private sector employers is that it's a great time, again, to look at your policies related to any gender issue, harassment, discrimination, reporting, retaliation, wage disparity, to make sure you don't have a wage gap. It's a great time to be proactive in taking your measures, such as training your supervisors and your managers. And really, not just on gender, but to make sure your employees are all treated fairly for any federal or state purpose. I mean, we've got all these different state and federal laws that cover sex, color, race, religion, national origin. States and the federal law address age, religious status, marital status, handicap, which is called disability under the federal law, and handicap under Florida law, veteran status, or any other protected reason. So if I had a crystal ball, kind of bringing this in for a landing, if I had a crystal ball, I would bet that the Department of Labor's enforcement will be stepped up under Secretary Walsh in taking these proactive steps with respect to OSHA, discrimination, gender disparity, harassment, all the things that we've talked about today will protect you not only under federal law, but under state law, and will create a healthier workplace that in turn, hopefully, will be a more profitable workplace as well. So we've listed a lot of resources for you here. These are our different blogs that we've written on these topics, and many of these blogs contain links within. And I think that you'll find these helpful as you move forward. And then, of course, all of our webinars are available for review at a later date.
Thanks, Amie. You know, circling back around, especially on the equity pay, we've had so many clients, our Colorado-based clients, that have been preparing for months for what is now the Equal Pay for Equal Work Act. And one of the things that I think a lot of employers outside of Colorado aren't tuned in yet is as they're hiring more people across the country and hiring a Colorado-based employee, they now are required to follow the legislation around the Equal Pay for Equal Work Act. So we do have a previous webinar on that specific Colorado legislation. We certainly are seeing California, Illinois, all states are kind of falling in line and making decisions around equity. So something definitely to keep track of, even if you're not, as an employer, status in that state. So we had a couple of good questions come in, Amie, and you know, I was looking at them, and when I saw them, I thought, okay, these are pretty simple questions, but I actually didn't know some of the answers. So I'm hoping they'll get the answer on the call. So the first question that's really great is, what's the effective date of executive orders? When do they go into effect?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because normally a law will get signed by state governor or by the president on a certain day, and it will say effective June 1 or effective July 1 is a common date. January 1 and July 1 are often common dates that give people, businesses, time, and agencies time to prepare for a new law being effective. But with executive orders, they're supposed to be implemented immediately. So in other words, if it's signed on January 1, it takes effect on January 1. And they're published in the Federal Register as soon as the president signs them, and the government and whoever's affected are legally required to carry them out at once. Practically, though, it's a little more complex than that, because as you've heard, many of these executive orders require agencies to do something, like establish a council, create a new position, or create a body of regulations, which can take time. So they're effective immediately, but often in practicality, they take time to implement.
Yeah, it seems to be a precursor for what's to come in a lot of ways. So
Yeah.
on the executive order, where can someone find more information if they were looking for more information on a particular executive order or just want to get an overall list?
Yeah, so there are so many great sources. The official source is in the Federal Register, which is federalregister.gov, and that's where they go immediately after they're signed. And you can even download a PDF if you want to read the entire thing. Many of them are very, very short, unlike many of our laws that can be, like, 3,000 pages of the PPP Act, the CARES Act. The executive orders can be 2 pages or 3 pages. I mean, they say it short and sweet, and they launch it, and then we're expected to comply with it. But the Federal Register is the answer to your question.
Great. All right, and then a bit of a more meaty question around, in terms of substance around the executive orders. How do Biden's first days compare to Trump's first days?
Well, that's a great question for me because, I like to dig into like statistics and facts. And I was really curious about looking at all the different executive orders. Like, for example, I didn't know that George Washington signed executive orders. So I've learned a lot in preparing for this. Yeah. But one of the things I learned is that presidents during their transition period often prepare executive orders so they can launch on day one. And Trump's first executive orders were signed shortly after inauguration on the 23rd and the 24th. And they, like Biden's in this term, they related to campaign promises that he made during his campaign. And they related to freezing the government hires, to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and to the construction of pipelines like the Keystone Pipeline. So they really do, you can, if somebody wins, you can look at what their campaign promises are, and you can look at those first executive orders, and you can see how they're launching. And it's also worth noting that a president can sign executive orders up until the moment before the next president is inaugurated. And so, in fact, in his final office, Trump signed almost a dozen new executive orders as he was preparing to leave the office. So that's a common practice as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Well, those were great questions. Thanks for the attendees that threw those out. And a couple of reminders, Amie. We are going to be sending out a recording to everyone that registered today. Please take advantage of our resource page. You can find out more information on both our websites, LandrumHR.com and HRQinc.com. We are looking forward to getting back to some in-person events and programming that we love to do within Landrum HR and HRQ, and hope that will start happening with more frequency. But we'll always be continuing to deliver our national level events and programming. And we have a couple upcoming on Tuesday, April the 27th. We have an ideal roundtable webinar about building an ideal talent pipeline. So there are HRCI and SHRM credits approved, and you can register on our website. And really in this session, we'll be talking about best practices and talent acquisition to assemble an ideal workforce, steps you should be taking to ensure you attract, nurture, and retain the best talent that will also help cultivate a sense of belonging for your workforce. Technology issues, challenges to expect. So have a panel of several different perspectives based on roles, racial and gender equity. So looking forward to that and hope you can join us. And then also our ongoing quarterly series with Brian Wilkerson in our consulting group on workforce and economic trends. So we'll cover Q1 on Thursday, April 29th. And again, you can register on our website. And if you haven't attended those webinars, really deep diving into quarterly trends and what we see as far as how that transfers into engaging our workforce during the time, specific actions that you should or shouldn't be taking. So Amie, thanks so much for your presentation today. On behalf of Amie and myself, Landrum HR and HRQ, thanks for attending.
Thank you.